Well, welcome everyone to our fall literary lecture series hosted by the Antrim Literature Project, an online public humanities platform that aims to make the study of literature accessible to readers beyond the university. We're happy to offer this series of free introductory lectures on a variety of literary topics. You can find all of the recorded lectures on our database at antrimliteratureproject.org. We have the pleasure tonight of hearing Cynthia Schmidt. Cynthia is currently a PhD candidate in English at St. John's University, following her Master of Fine Arts in Writing with a concentration in speculative fiction from Sarah Lawrence College. She has taught at SUNY Purchase and the Bronx High School for Contemporary Arts and served as a workshop facilitator via the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence for Yonkers Public Schools and the Teaching Artist Project, among others. In addition to her full-time studies, she currently teaches as an adjunct instructor of writing at Fordham University and Marist College, as well as St. John's. Cynthia's research is primarily in folklore studies, particularly modern feminist retellings of myth and fairy tale in modern media. Her other research interests include pop culture and critical media studies, pedagogy, feminist and eco-criticism, composition and rhetoric, genre theory and speculative writing, especially utopian and dystopian studies, and interdisciplinarity and transmedial studies. Cynthia's dissertation in progress centers around the matriarchal mythopoetic narratives and transmedial modalities. So Cynthia's talk tonight is titled A Chorus of Mythologized Women. Cynthia, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Anna. I really appreciate it. That bio was shorter when I sent it, or I thought it was going to be shorter when I sent it in. But that's me. I do have a PowerPoint that I'm working with. That's kind of how I operate. And so I'll try to do that. We're gonna follow along. So let me pull it up. And just checking that we can all see that. Yep, great, wonderful. Okay. All right, so I will click through. Just again, a big thank you to Antrim for this. The little plug there, the website right there. And again, that's just my background. So I have a dual degree in human relations and English writing from High Point, MFA in speculative writing from Sarah Lawrence, and then I'm currently getting my PhD. And I've taught at a bunch of places. And so my interest, as I've described, I'm not going to go through that again, but this was my abstract for this lecture, so I can just kind of go through that quickly. So a huge push in publishing at the moment has been focusing on the voices of women in traditional mythology that have sort of been cast to the sides and mistreated most often for the development of the heroes, right, that we're most aware of, right? So we can think of, some big names, right, like Odysseus, right, or Theseus or Perseus or things like that. But I'm saying, what of Iphigenia, right, or Arethusa or Briomartis, right, or so many other women whose names that we're never even going to know, and how many had such a huge impact on those stories, right? And so this talk was a compilation of some research that I was lucky enough to do I got an opportunity to study in Italy for about a month, and deep dive into some of this research. And so we're going to be looking particularly in the Greco-Roman tradition, because I think that there's a whole field of non-Western folklore that is really important to, I think, to do justice to it. And so for this, we're going to just focus on the Greco-Roman stuff. So like Medusa, right? The Gorgon is a big figure, but also her sisters, right? Steno and Uriel. Penelope is the wife of Odysseus. Phaedra is the wife of Theseus, and some various nymphs and things like that. And so we're going to go in and really hear their voices for this talk. So I have just like a little lecture outline, again, how I do it. So there's an article that I'm gonna pull up super briefly to just give us an introduction. And I have just a couple of statements, and then we'll transition to that textual analysis. Okay. So the first statement I have is an intersectionality statement. So again, this idea, right, of the sort of intersections between, right, these overlapping categories. There's a wonderful theorist named Kimberly Crenshaw who sort of coined the term, right, and it's sort of these overlapping identity categories that we each inhabit, right, so including like class differentials, right, like gender, sexuality, things like that. And so again, I just want to say that this is, occupying just a few positionalities, right, but there's a whole world out there with a whole lot of vibrancy that I really encourage you to research on your own if it interests you in different traditions. And so, so what we're going with today is the focus statement, like telling is retelling. And so this idea that, right, like with all of these, this myths and folklore, it's all coming from oral tradition, right? And all of those oral traditions, they shifted and they changed with each, right, with each telling, with each audience. And so there really is, it's essentially impossible to trace it back to like a singular, right, base version, right? So there really are no sort of true myths, because these storytellers throughout time reflect the sort of cultural moments and individual thinking and entertainment, like it says there. So one of the texts that I'm going to be highlighting is a book called Phaedra. It's by Lauren Shepherdson, and there's a prologue of a bard singing. And so the very first thing it says, the story the bard sang wasn't the truth. He had no idea what the truth was. He wasn't from Athens, and he'd been passed the song by another traveling minstrel in exchange for his last piece of bread. But as he sang, he observed the crowd jeer when he sung about the princess, and cheer when he mentioned Theseus' son, Hippolytus. He began to tailor his story to their liking, and his audience laughed it all up. Because he was a more observant man than most, though, he noticed the shadowy figures on the edge of the assembly, cloths pulled over to disguise their faces, which would surely be female faces. Unlike the others, they were not whooping and cheering for the young prince as his heroic father. The bard noticed their disapproval, but he didn't care. He didn't sing for women. They couldn't pay for his songs. So again, that was right in the prologue, and I think that sets the tone kind of nicely for us, right? To introduce this idea, right, of tailoring the version based on who, right, who's telling it and who's listening, and kind of who matters by extrapolating that. So right, there's this article called Rewriting Ariadne. So I think I have, let me see if I want to do a new share. Oh gosh, technology, intimidating. All right. Here, let's try that. Did it shift it? Did it do it? Great, awesome. Okay. So let me scroll up. I was a little bit down further, just refreshing myself. Right, so this is an article by Bethany Williams, and it's called Rewriting Ariadne, What is Her Myth? And it's about how the story of Ariadne really had so many endings, right? So Ariadne, super briefly, was princess of Crete, and therefore she was the brother of the Minotaur, right? The big bull-headed creature, right, with the body of a man, who was in the center of the labyrinth, right? And so famously, right, there's Ariadne's string, which you see in this picture right here. She's giving it to Theseus, right? The red ball of twine, so he could navigate the labyrinth, right, and eventually slay the Minotaur. And so after that, right, in the traditional myth, Ariadne, right, you can see There's some stuff there, right? Death of a brother, so he killed the Minotaur, right? And then she goes away with Theseus as the story goes, right? And then after she goes away with him, that's where it starts to get really, really murky. Okay, so there are several variations, right? In one version, they both die together. And you can see, I like this article, right, because it references some of the original text. And I'm working more with the retellings, but this gives, right, the specific, right? So you see this is like Homer's Odyssey, right, right here. So, um, so yeah, in one version, right, when Ariadne and the crew of the ship landed at Naxos, she was killed by the goddess Artemis, right? That's a version, because they offended Dionysus. That's a version. Another version is that they separated, right, unwillingly from each other, Theseus and Ariadne, and because Dionysus wanted her to be his wife, for his own. So that's from Diodorus, in a version. Then there's yet another version that Theseus betrays her. That one's pretty common, pretty widely known. And there's a pretty well documented perspective on her rage, right? Ariadne's rage right here. On uh where is yeah, Cantillus, the Roman poet, poem 64, right? She's saying, O false Theseus, that you leave me on this desolate strand. I snatched you from the midst of the whirlpool of death, preferring to suffer the loss of a brother rather than fail your need in the supreme hour, O ingrate. Right, so that kind of gives her a little bit of personality, that's all we get of her. So I have the reason that I bring up this article. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. It shifted back, right? Did it do it? Did it shift back to my PowerPoint? Okay, great, thank you. And so, right, something that I discuss is sort of the negative space of the story, right, between the worlds of folklore and how there's so many interpretations, right? So Ariadne is just one example, right, of so many different ways, right? Even in the base story, there's a lot of different interpretations based on how you tell it, right? So there's a few different texts that we're going to look at now. So I have it kind of broken down into the voices and then the chorus. So first I have a poem by Louise Glick, who is incredible. If you aren't aware, she is an incredible, she actually, I think she died last month, which is tragic. But she won the 2020 Nobel Prize in literature. She also won the Pulitzer Prize, I believe, National Book Award. She was the Poet Laureate of the United States for a few years. And she drew on mythology quite heavily in a lot of her works. And there was a lot of scholarship around sort of her use of personage and the personal voice in comparison with mythology, which of course is of interest to me in my background. So we'll read a mythic fragment by Glick just to open us up, and then I'll go into some excerpts from Wake Siren, Ovid Resung by Nina McLaughlin. That whenever English majors, whenever they ask you like, oh, like what's your favorite book, right? It's like choosing children almost. It's like how can you narrow that down? How can you essentialize that? But this is kind of my right. This is my answer now. Is the book Wake Siren, because it's so brilliant. She's fantastic, and she does different forms, and it's kind of like an anthology of all these different women. It's spectacular. So we'll read a couple of them from there, and then from the chorus, I have some lines from the Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. So Penelope was famously the wife of Odysseus, right? And so like Odysseus, right, in the Odyssey, the Odyssey being his entire long, like 20 years long journey home, right, from the Trojan War and all of the things that, beset him. And all Penelope really gets is that she was like a loyal and steadfast wife waiting for him while he had all these escapades, right? So Atwood, another super well-known figure, right? She gives Penelope a voice, and she gives a voice particularly to the 12 hanged maids, which is kind of a lesser known thing, and that's sort of really interesting. So similarly, Phaedra, which I already mentioned before, she directly names the night chorus, is what she calls it, which is partially what inspired my name. So there's that, and then Natalie Haynes has a few books. One of them is called A Thousand Ships. The other one's called Stone Blind. I don't think I have a text from Stone Blind, but that's that. So we'll just get into it because it's there's so much to do. So yeah, that's that one. Okay. So this is Glick's mythic fragment. So it says, when the stern god approached me with his gift, my fear enchanted him so that he ran more quickly through the wet grass, as he insisted, to praise me. I saw captivity in praise. Against the lyre, I begged my father in the sea to save me. When the god arrived, I was nowhere. I was in a tree forever. Reader, pity Apollo at the water's edge. I turned from him. I summoned my invisible father. As I stiffened in the god's arms of his encompassing love, my father made no other sign from the water. So this one is referring to the nymph Daphne, right? And so it directly names, right, the god Apollo, the sun god, and he was chasing her because he was struck by an arrow from Cupid, a golden tipped arrow that filled him with this like unquenchable love. And then Cupid had struck Daphne with a lead arrow that made her repulsed from all love. And the reason that that happened was because Apollo and Cupid got into an argument and over an insult, and that's why that happened, right? So that's another thing that I just really appreciate and love is just the intertextuality, right? And how every myth is informed by every other myth, right? And they all kind of tangentially touch and bounce off of one another. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for growth in those intersections, right? Which I think is a lot of modern writers are taking advantage of. Super cool. So with that, right? So Daphne, the idea of Daphne, right? So we'll go into Nina McLaughlin's version of Daphne. And so this one, again, McLaughlin works in a lot of different kind of forms. And so some of them are, keep the sort of mythic, like ancient feel, and then some of them are much more modern sounding. And some of them kind of blend both of them. And so you can kind of determine for yourself where some of them are just sort of timeless. They could go either way. So this is one. So it says, I knew when they wanted me. Some people can't tell, are blind to it, the heat behind the eyes. I could see it, heat and hunger. That was always a part of it. Eyes that lingered even when I wasn't the one talking. That crackle in the air, the elevated energy of desire, as though my particles were around us were sped up. I could smell the friction. I could feel it behind my ribs. They'd lean in, wanting to share our smells, or lean back, wanting to show their shoulders. It was so plain. Most of all, the biggest tell, the weakness. The way we are when we're at the mercy of our want. It's hard not to feel a little tender at that point. But this was also when things could get bad. They'd feel that weakness, some of them, and not know that's what they felt, but they wouldn't want to feel it, feared it, how frightening desire can be, how scary want. We're rendered raw and open to the wound like a just hatched bird with all those veins. To want something is to enter into the risk that you might not get it. They wouldn't know it was fear they were feeling, but they wouldn't like what they felt, and they want to make themselves feel brave and strong. They were overbold to hide it, try to prove mostly how tough they were, how courageous, how dominant. Hey, pretty girl, you busy tonight? Is your father immortal? Is your mama from Mount Olympus? I'd like a taste of that. I'd like to fuck that. I always knew. No chance. So that's giving Daphne a voice. And so McLaughlin, in her afterword, talks about sort of channeling the voices of each of these women, and what they sounded like, which I think is a really fascinating process, because right, Glick is also talking about Daphne, right, in a very, very different, way, in a very different context, and with very different tone, which is again super cool to me. And so I have there's a Dawn Raffle adaptation. So Dawn Raffle wrote another story of Daphne, and this is actually, it's not rewriting the myth, it's actually kind of taking off from the end of where her myth leaves off, right? So her myth ends that, as we sort of saw in Glick's poem, right? Apollo chased her until she called on her father, the river god, and he turned her into a tree, right? And so she became a laurel tree, right? And that's why Apollo, right, he took the laurels as kind of his symbol to like honor Daphne. So that's kind of interesting. But Raffle's story takes the story, and it has Daphne in the tree petitioning Apollo's twin sister, the goddess Artemis, the moon, and she petitions her after however many years to release her, and she does. And so it's kind of what it's like when she comes out of the tree and now she's an old woman, and what her life looks like, which is again a completely new version of Daphne's story, which is really cool. So right, so again, just with just the one character, there's a lot of different directions you can go, but there's so many more characters, right? This is a chorus of mythologized women, so there's so many women, right? And how many women just got right, like throwaway lines? How many women were not named at all, right? In the in there. So this next part, I know the text is a little thin, so it's okay. We don't have to read that. But it's Arachne. So Arachne was in myth. She was a very very talented weaver on the loom. So talented that she even challenged the goddess Minerva, the goddess of weaving, saying that she could weave better than her, right? And so Athena came, she challenged her to a contest, revealed herself as a goddess. And then, as the story goes, Arachne's was actually better, and Athena got upset and she turned her into a spider. And she said, now all of your webs, right, will be beautiful, but they will be so easily brushed away by by a wind or by a hand, right? And all of your children will be spiders, and that's why we have spiders, right? And that's why spiders weave their webs. So that's kind of cool. So this McLaughlin's version tells of that encounter, but she illustrates what was exactly on the tapestry. And in her version, she says that she basically illustrated a litany of all of the crimes, all of the times where, right, the gods forced themselves on mortals in various ways, and it explicitly showed that, right? And so each of these, again, I'll provide this right in the handout after this talk, but so you can go through each of them, right? But she says like all of the power, all of the lies, right? They don't fear mistakes because they don't know consequences. Never guilty, never punished. I showed you each crime. I showed you all as criminals. You murder, you rape, you violate, and it's us who fall. Why am I the only one to say it? Right. And she says, I say the names of the fallen. And she lists all the names right there, which I think is really powerful. So that's Arachne. And then this last one I have for the voices themselves is Juno, right? So Juno is the Roman version of Hera, right? Hera's the Greek version. And so she is, right, the wife of Zeus or Jove, right, who is the king of the gods. So she's the queen of the gods. And so she famously, right, just is very antagonistic towards all of, right, Zeus's affair partners, regardless of whether or not they were consensual in that encounter. It just kind of across the board, she persecutes them, especially when they're pregnant, right, especially when they bear children to him. And so this section is actually from it's kind of interesting because it's her talking to Echo, right? So Echo was a nymph who fell in love with Narcissus. And so she turned her basically so that she couldn't say anything of her own. She could only repeat what others said to her. And the reason being that Echo was a close confidant of Juno, and she would feed her information, kind of gossip to her so that she would know about Zeus's like going on and stuff like that, until right Echo affronted her in some way, and so she cursed her in that way. But so I felt like I couldn't really include right a chorus of mythologized women without touching on Hera and Juno, because I feel like so often she's not touched on at all, because it's sort of very antithetical, right, to this like women's solidarity message, right? Because it's not all like that. It's very, like there's a darker side to things, right? There's contention, there's competition, right? And so where does that come in, right? It comes in the myth, so why don't we talk about it here? So this I like this section from her. So she says, I know my power. I know the way I shift the energy of any room I enter. The heat and light that comes off of me, I know it. Look at me. The command of my height, the spread of my shoulders, I stand with strength. I am immortal. See the swell of my breast pressing up against the saffron robe, draping my body like it was painted on my flesh. Do you see? Not just beautiful, powerful. The sweeping rise of my throat, The warmth and ferocity of my mouth, the wide bones of my skull, the swell and lift of my cheeks, the skin the color of coconut flesh, blonde white hair that sweeps like a cresting wave above my forehead, my cheeks flushed, my eyes hold every moonrise and the spark and current of every ounce of menstrual blood released from all the women who bleed. I am for the women, don't you see? But there are so many, and they are so new and so tempting for my Jove, my beloved, who cannot resist young women, who cannot resist the nymphs. But what am I supposed to do with the anger? I share my life with him. Are these women to blame? It's not a question I can spend my time answering. Punishing them, watching them die, it's one way to let out the anger, but it brings me no relief. One gone, he finds another, and it happens again, again, again. These poor women, but this poor me. Someone has to pay. I watched Semele burn. It brought me no relief. So that's channeling Juno, the kind of like the contradiction and duality of women, which I think is really cool. Okay. So with a super short amount of time that we have left, I know that we're kind of cutting it, but I'm gonna just briefly address the chorus themselves. So I have the Penelopiad, Phaedra, and Haines. Okay, so just super quick. This is Penelope addressing the reader. So this is the beginning of the Penelopiad, literally page 2. And she's in the underworld, and she's saying, hadn't I been faithful, right? Hadn't I waited, but what did that amount to? An edifying legend, a stick used to beat other women with, when they didn't get in line, right? So she's kind of self-aware, right, of her own of and so the 12 maids, right? So the famously, right, when Odysseus came back from war, there was this contest to prove that he was Odysseus, right, to fend off all the suitors that had come to take Penelope. But all of the maids who serviced Penelope and her suitors, he hanged them all. Him and his son hanged Telemachus. And so this section was about how they were born to parents who weren't nymphs or naiads or gods, right? They were sweet, wenches, and they did the laundry, and they baked the bread, and how they didn't have these godly fathers, right? They were real actual women, and what happened to them, right? And in that so that's from the maids. Again, super quickly, going right into Phaedra, she specifically addresses the night chorus. She says that it's like a cacophony of voices warning each other, right? Don't go into his room alone, right? Like always go in pairs. He won't hurt you. He's okay. Things like that. So that's really based in the reality of the real lived experiences of some of these women, right? And in the palace kitchens, right? And saying this man is dangerous, actually stay away from him, right? And so how that was preserved or lost, really, right, in these grand sweeping epic narratives that get promoted throughout history, but we don't get this kind of nuance to it. Right, The Thousand Ships talks about the Trojan women, the women of the Trojan War. That's what that is. And so lastly, I have these reflection and discussion questions, and for us to sort of think about. So that's I have look back, look between, look inward, and look around. So to look back, so if history is written by the winners, who does that leave behind? And what are the values that promote one narrative and then negate the validity of another? Sort of what we were just talking about. To look between, right, that intersectional lens. So, right, layering, right, the class differentials, right. So Phaedra or Ariadne, right, they were princesses of Crete versus, right, like the bull leaper, who danced at her wedding, right, or the servants, right, who served their wine, and what the experience of those women, how that was different. To look inward, right? So what parts of your own story have you maybe mythologized? Or what narratives do you feel like are being told around you? And how might you be able to sort of rewrite and trace it back and shift the perspective in a sort of a more transformative way? And then to look around, and to understand that, what, or to identify for yourself, right? What do you feel are the aspects of telling a good story or hearing a good story? And I also encourage us to think about the way that we tell stories and how that might be evolving in the digital world, right? In this kind of digital setting. I think that's an interesting question for us to ponder. Okay, so that's all I have. It's important work to be done. I think it's valid. I think it's super cool, interesting, but I really appreciate those of you who attended. And that's my email. I'd love to field any questions. Thanks, guys.